You are listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and I'm here again with Jen Oyama Murphy. Jen, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me back, Adam.
I have asked you to join me today to talk about the U diagram of healing. And the U diagram was developed by Kathy Lorzell. For those of you who don't know about it, I talk about it in great detail in podcast episodes 24 to 26. I'm going to summarize Kathy's U diagram in a moment. And then today's episode will focus on some of Jen's thoughts about the U diagram, which I have found to be very helpful and enlightening and true. So let me summarize it. The U diagram begins with the premise that the core of the Christian narrative is contained in 3 days: Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Jesus was crucified on a Friday. He was traumatized and abused. On Sunday, he was resurrected. In other words, despite the trauma and abuse of Friday, resurrection happened. Sunday happened. It happened. In order to get from the trauma of Friday to the healing of Sunday, Jesus had to experience the hell of Saturday. And the U diagram posits that what was true for Jesus is true for us. There's no way to get from Friday to Sunday without going through something of the hell of Saturday. In other words, without dipping down into the valley of the shadow of death. So imagine a U in your mind. The very beginning of the U, the top left, represents Friday. The end of the U, the top right, represents Sunday. That is healing. The bottom of the U represents Saturday. And the Old Testament repeatedly uses 3 metaphors to describe the Saturday experience. It talks about the wilderness, the desert, and the valley. Saturday is about the wilderness. It's about the desert. It's about being in the valley of the shadow of death. So one pattern of healing is this: revisiting heartache in your family of origin, i.e. the crucifixion of Friday, leads you into the wilderness and the desert, the descent of Saturday, which ends in healing, the resurrection of Sunday. The U diagram points out that what many of us want to do is dance on a little dotted line across the top of the U, straight across from Friday to Sunday. We want to skip merrily along the top, moving quickly from trauma to healing. And here's the problem with that. There is no way to get to joy and healing without going through the valley of the shadow of death. There is no dotted line. There's no way to skip over the depths. You can't dance your way gleefully from Friday to Sunday. So the U diagram, in summary, maintains that in order to experience healing, you need to dip down into the descent of Saturday, which means feeling big feelings like grief, sorrow, terror, rage. And Jen, you've been listening patiently. This year, I heard you give a talk about your experience with the U diagram, your reflections on the U diagram. And I've asked you to come on the podcast to share some of those feelings and thoughts about the U. So perhaps we could just begin here. Like, as you listen to me kind of summarize it, and I know you're very familiar with it, what things get stirred up for you?
Stirred is a good word. I really appreciate the U diagram. I think it's a really brilliant, clear, very true in many ways depiction of the Allender theory and the Allender methodology. And it makes a lot of sense in my head. And yet every time I've heard it or seen it on paper, it has created a stirring, which I would say is almost more of an agitation or dissonance in my body. We've referenced Resmaa Menakem a lot, but I find him to be brilliant, prophetic. And one of the things that he has said is that our bodies need to hum, right? They need to find that limbic resonance with other bodies. And that it's that humming that leads to a sense of attachment that offers us safety and security and allows for the development and healing. And as a Asian American woman, I've often struggled to feel that kind of attunement in both personal and collective spaces. And I think that's because I live here in America in a world that's really written in a Western key with a white melody. And so my Japanese American body often feels like it's off tune, like I'm playing the wrong notes. And so I can interpret that as I'm either too flat or too sharp. And I think that's what happens for me in my body as I listen to this summary of the youth theory. There's so much about it that's on key, and yet there's still a dissonance that I feel in my body.
You've heard the teaching about the you for years and years and years. What prompted you to begin like reevaluating your thinking about it?
It was really from doing group work. It was about 4 years ago, and I have the privilege of being able to, facilitate story groups at the Allender Center. And one of the groups that I had in one of our training programs had these two extraordinary women of color. And it was really one of the first times that I've ever had a group where there were participants of color in my group. And so there was one Black woman and one Mexican American woman in the group. And I was trying to apply this youth theory to them and their stories, and it wasn't working. They were getting frustrated and feeling missed in my engagement with them, and I was getting frustrated and just trying harder and harder. And it was through a lot of conversation and some repair that was needed, that we started to question what we were hearing around the U theory. So we came back from one of the lectures on the U theory, and that buzzing or that humming in our bodies was happening in the room. And we just started talking about our reactions to the youth theory. And it was through that conversation that I realized that as women of color, their war or their fight was not about dropping into the bottom of the U. It was the realization that brought a lot of grief for all of us that they live in the bottom of the U. Their war was around how to rise up out of it. And that really opened up a whole different perspective for me and how to engage the you or how to understand it.
One of the premises of the U diagram is that we tend to resist staying in the bottom of the U, lingering in death, if you will. We tend to resist feeling those big emotions like terror, rage, grief, sorrow. And we have various ways of popping up. And these women in your group, what you realized, if I'm hearing you right, Jen, is that it's not merely that they didn't do that. They didn't have that as an option. It wasn't an option for them in their day-to-day life to decide when they want to descend into the you and engage some of these big feelings. They had big feelings like terror, sorrow, grief, rage all the time.
Right. I think there's a kind of privilege that some have, in order to build that bridge from Friday to Sunday, and invitation to do that that's not available to people that are marginalized or oppressed. Those survival or cheap gospel techniques are not available to them in the same ways that people who have privilege can access.
Yeah. So, like, as a white man, I have the option of trying to dance across from Friday to Sunday. It doesn't work, but I have that option. And here's another option I have. I get to decide today if I want to engage some of the bigger, scarier feelings that reside in my heart. I get to decide today if I want to engage the sorrow, the terror, the grief, the rage that I have from my story and my family of origin. Like, that's a choice I get to make. And what these two women in your group helped you realize was that that's not a choice for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think the U does assume a certain level of agency and a level of power that is not true for everyone. And that it also is thinking more in terms of the personal and individual story. It's not necessarily taking into consideration that there are systems and powers and principalities that actually are designed to keep people at the bottom of the U, and that those systems and powers and principalities have created a world where that kind of suffering isn't an episodic 1, 2, 3 time event. It is a chronic system that's in place every day, every minute of certain people's lives. There's a collective narrative that is a part of the you for some people that is incredibly important and relevant to the you theory that's different than just a personal or individual story.
Right. Because when I think about the U diagram, when I went through the certificate program at the Allender Center and was first taught it, it was solely about my family of origin trauma. There was no layer for me of systemic trauma, the powers and principalities that are at play in this world through white supremacy and the byproducts of racial trauma. That layer, it didn't exist for me. I don't have to deal with it. I'm a white man. But that layer exists if you're a person of color.
Yes, and I think too that it's funny because when I first saw the U theory, I actually instinctively found myself reading it from right to left instead of starting at the left and going to the right, which is somewhat cultural for me, being Japanese. But I think that there was something too that I felt in my body that there is a power out there that is actually wanting me to move away from my glory and is trying to push me into the bottom of the U so that I go back to the places where there's brokenness and powerlessness and helplessness. And that's how I instinctively actually read the trajectory of the U, because I think that has been both my collective and personal story, much more so than, starting at the place where there's hopelessness, going through the process of finding those big feelings and having any sort of imagination for what it could look like to come up on the other side, where you're stepping more fully into your calling, into your glory, into your goodness.
Say more. I want to hear more. Say more about this.
I think, like before on the other podcast we were on, I was talking about feeling the weight of racism, the weight of white supremacy and privilege, the weight of those powers and principalities that are pushing down and wanting particular people to basically stay in the grave, right? To stay in a type of hell. And it's one thing, I think, to feel that in your particular story, in your family of origin, and there is a certain type of hope and resilience and faith and love that's required to be able to drop into that and begin to step into the restoration and healing process. It's another thing to do that when you feel like you are up against these profoundly dark and insidious powers. What that requires of your heart and body, I think for many of us, feels incredibly overwhelming and hopeless.
I'm reminded of your words earlier that for that African American woman and that Mexican American woman in your group, the issue was not how are you popping up out of the U, avoiding things that you need to engage. The issue was all the things that are keeping you from rising up, all the things that are keeping you from inhabiting the fullness of your body and the fullness of your glory, all the things that are pressing you on a daily basis down.
Right. It wasn't, they didn't need someone to stand up at the top and tell them you need to go down to the bottom. I think what they needed was for the group, for me, to bear witness to the incredible amount of suffering that their bodies have held, both personally and collectively, in the bottom. And in some ways, as much as we're able to bear witness and be with them in that, and join them in the war for hope that they too can rise. They too can experience a type of freedom and healing and still being able to hold on to the reality that it is not going to look like everyone else or the majority of people. Like even in that particular story group that I was in, the trajectory that they had and what healing looked like for them was pretty different than what it looked like for some of the other participants who happened to be white in the group.
And for those of us who are either working with people of color in story work or wanting to work with people of color doing story work, like this is a big deal. This is something that I need to get if I'm going to be effective as part of somebody's healing journey. You've already put words to it, but can you say more about the limitations? I mean, I know that you bless the goodness of the U diagram, the parts of it that are spot on, but we're coming up against its limitations. And its limitations for people of color who have a very different experience living in a white dominant society. So, can you say some more about its limitations, Jen? Or for those people that either are people of color or wanting to work with people of color, what are some of the things we need to keep in mind when we listen to or look at the U diagram?
Well, I think one of the first things is to think about the collective and the cultural, right? That all our stories, every story has a cultural context. And if you miss the cultural context, you're going to miss something of the story. And so to not assume the Western white context when you come into a story or when you begin to engage the story. I think that's one thing. You have to do your own work too. To go back to one of the core tenets of story work is you can't take people into places where you are unwilling to go or haven't gone yourself. And so you have to have some sense of what your face, your story, your body is bringing into the room, is bringing into the story engagement, and where you locate yourself in that you, and what your own story, both personal and collective, is in the you. I think too that requires looking at historical, ancestral, collective narratives that are impacting the personal narratives. I think also too to use psychological and theological categories can be super helpful, but for most of us, those categories are very Western. And so to even have some curiosity and being able to expand what those categories look like before applying them to a story and not making the assumption that the window of tolerance as we've understood it with very kind of Western parameters is going to work or be kind and true for every person. I've had the privilege of being able to partner with certain people in doing story work. And I was in a group where we had a young Asian man who was in the group, and he was the only Asian in the group. And his affect was muted. And he was pretty serious and quiet. And my co leader was understanding him to be resistant to dropping into the bottom of the U and felt like he was out of the window of tolerance in what we call the hypoarousal state. And in doing kind of consultation with one another, I was saying, like, I think we're missing that because culturally he's right where he should be. And in fact, for him to even walk into this room, he's dropped down into the bottom of the U. For him to bring his Asian male, and he was also the oldest son of immigrant parents, for him just to come into the room, he dropped into the bottom. But because we have a Western way of understanding and reading and interpreting his face and his story, we've missed that.
This is such a big deal. Culture matters. It even shifts the window of tolerance. In other words, the window of tolerance is that place on the affect regulation scale. If affect regulation is new to you, go back and listen to episode 20. I talk about it in detail. But there is a place in us, a state of being where we get panicky, anxious, hyper aroused. And there's the place that you just referenced, Jen, where we kind of get shut down and numbed out and disconnect. And that's called hypoarousal. And what you're saying is that, and it's true, and we know this, neuroscience knows this, that with different cultures, the window of tolerance shifts. So for this young man, he wasn't hypoaroused. He just appeared that way, especially from white Western eyes.
Yeah. Again, I think here is another instance where the instinct was to say that we need to take him from the top of the U down to the bottom because we're reading his face in a way that's saying that he's resistant to entering into a process where he's willing to address his story, step into grief, step into shame. But again, for him to just sign up and come into the room required something different of him than, most of the other people in the group, which for me was like, oh no, he isn't resistant. He's already taken a tremendous amount of risk. He's already breaking family norms and loyalty structures. He's already battling shame just to come and take a seat in the circle. And so we need to meet him in a different place.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm just, as a therapist, I wasn't in this particular group, but I could see myself being your co-leader in this group and having the exact same reaction. And here's what's terrifying for me, just as a therapist, is this young man was actually, what was required of him was immense courage, merely to step into a white space. That's number one. But courage to, in some ways, begin the process of breaking family loyalties by entering this very work and sharing a story of his family of origin in this group. And what's terrifying for me is the thought that that could have actually gotten pathologized, that his courage could, it's not just a little bit of missing him, it's taking what's actually immensely courageous and repentant, all the things that the bottom of the U represents, and calling it the opposite, all because I'm not aware of some cultural things of this man's culture. This work is a form of surgery on the heart, and we can wield tools that are sharp. And if we don't understand somebody's cultural context, we can do harm unintentionally, but harm nonetheless.
Right. And I think then there's the invitation to us to be curious about other cultures. If you're going to do this work, then to read and learn and engage people who are different than you. We at the Allender Center have the category of archetype, which we use a lot as a kind of reference points. Even our prophet, priest, king, and queen are kind of these archetypal categories that we use at the top of the U. And the more that I do this work, the more that I see like even that needs to be nuanced because we don't have a lot of non-Western images or understandings of, especially the king queen, but even the priest and prophet, at least for me, of what that looks like culturally. And so some of the categories that we have that just feels so familiar. I think taking the time to sit down with some of those and explore some of the other categories that they reference in other cultures, I think can be really helpful in helping us know just other narratives, other keys, I guess, of the song that we want to play.
Yes. And if we take seriously the claim that every human being is created in the image of this God that we worship, that means that every culture bears something of the diversity of the glory of the Godhead, of the triune God. And that means that God, it's not that God is not white, it's that he's also Japanese. He's also Japanese American, which is different than Japanese. He's also Nigerian. And if we take that seriously, we have to mine the cultures of the world for the glory of God. And we can only do that in particularity with people of those regions, of those cultures. one of the reasons I wanted you to come on the podcast today is because one aim of this podcast is to equip people to do story work. We believe that transformation primarily happens by engaging one's story. And one thing I'm hearing from you is that that story has to be an understanding of one's collective and cultural story, not merely one's family of origin story. So, story engagement is key as long as we understand it comprehensively. One of the things you talked about this year that was moving to me was how a story, two stories in the Gospel of Mark, shed light for you on how Jesus engages with the U diagram, how Jesus engages us in the context of this U diagram. Could you say some about these two stories that mean something to you in Mark 5?
Yeah, because I come out of a ministry background, it's been so helpful for me to be able to lean into gospel stories that reflect something of the psychological theory that I'm learning. And for me, the story of the woman with the issue of blood and Jairus in Mark 5 has been really helpful framework for understanding and applying the U theory in a way that I think is inviting me to be like Jesus more than my performance self can, I think, sometimes allow if I get stuck on how do I apply a certain theory in the correct way, and then I'm out of my body, and then I'm out of the story, and then I'm not actually present with the person. So I think for me, locating myself and the person I'm engaging in another story, in the story of the gospel, has been very helpful for me being able to stay in my body and to keep my face in front of the person whose story I have the honor of engaging. So in the Mark 5 story, there is a man who has some power and privilege named Jairus who is suffering. His daughter is sick, but in my mind, he has the opportunity in some ways to build a bridge, perhaps, across that suffering by having the power and privilege to be able to come straight up to Jesus and ask for what he needs. And in contrast, there is a woman who has been suffering for 12 years. It's the woman with the issue of blood who has been ostracized and marginalized, and she does not have that power and privilege, and so is crawling on the ground, which to me is a picture of living at the bottom of the U, and has to kind of take a swipe at Jesus's garment with the hopes of getting some sense of relief. And what I love about Jesus in this story is that he is able to engage and tend to both people. So the idea that if we engage one way with one group of people, that is going to take away from the engagement and healing with another group of people. In this gospel story, that isn't true. They both get healing, but it comes in a different way, in a particular way that I think brings them through the you in ways that heal not just the something of the personal, but something also that they have experienced for good or bad, for privilege or marginalization collectively as well. So when I'm in a group, I think I'm trying to locate myself somewhat in the story of Mark. There's the disciples who are frustrated that Jesus isn't paying attention to the person who has power and privilege. There's the people at the house who, because they aren't able to drop into the bottom of the U, they aren't able to grieve, they end up mocking Jesus and Jairus, which is probably not an experience he has had before. But on the other hand, the woman has had that experience of people mocking her. But in her story, Jesus stops the crowd and has them, in some ways, invites them to honor her by making space for her and has her come forward and tell him the whole truth of her story. And then he names her daughter. And so to me, there's just like the ups and downs of the U theory embedded in that story, and it's helpful for me to locate myself and ask myself, like, who am I today in that story? Because there are times where I can relate to Jairus, that I do have certain powers, I do have certain privilege, and there's other days, and most days I feel like I relate to the woman with the issue of blood. And because of both of those orientations in the story, I think it's helped me then try to be more like Jesus, and how I engage people.
And I think it has to be noted, and it's not just in Mark 5, it is all over the Gospel of Luke, that Jesus often lets his agenda be interrupted so that he can tend to the least of these, the marginalized, the outcasts. He interrupts his engagement with Jairus, or he lets himself be interrupted by this woman.
Yeah, and I think takes the risk to engage in a very provocative and non-traditional sort of way. It reminds me of an experience that you and I had leading a group together where, we've been trained to engage, right? To ask questions, to reflect back to people, using words to kind of press in to stories with kindness, but to press in, and to do a lot of processing in the way that we do story work. And again, there's nothing bad or wrong about that. But like you and I found ourselves, in a group, with a woman who has given me permission to share this, but who was Chinese, or is Chinese, had suffered profound trauma, immigrated here. English was her second language, had been told all her life to speak up more, say more. Partly why your trauma is happening to you is because you're not saying more. And had shared some of her story with us, and then just became really quiet and still. And what we chose to do in that moment was, I think, to honor her and her particular story, and sat with her in silence for a long time, and not in a dissociative or dismissive way. Our entire group turned their face toward her and joined her in that silence for, a good 20, almost 30 minutes. And looking back on that, I think we sat with her in the bottom of her you in a way that she had never experienced before. She has had people at the top two ends, I think, saying a lot to her in a language that was not her own, asking her to do things that culturally felt dissonant to her. And so our willingness to kind of go outside the box and consider who she was as her Hong Kong Chinese woman suffering self felt to me like us being more like Jesus to the woman with the issue of blood with her. And I think there was a profound sense of healing that came to her that had nothing to do with our insights, but more to do with us bringing our diverse bodies into the space with her and honoring her with our silence.
And honoring the process that her body was leading us into, that she needed, which was, she needed witness. She needed us to bear witness, if only for 20 to 30 minutes, because yes, it was a long time, but it was a drop in the bucket compared to the suffering that she had endured. But we were bearing witness in silence, and she led us there. So there's there needs to be a humility when we're doing this kind of work. And I think, Jen, particularly for those of us who are white, when we're working with people of color, there has to be a willingness to be led, even as we are needed and our expertise is needed. There has to be a willingness to be led, which is an odd endeavor.
Yeah, and I think led in ways that don't make sense to us, right? Like, it probably made a little more sense to me in our group than it did to you, and you followed my lead
Right.
in that. But even to me, it went against how I've been trained to lead not just story groups, but any sort of small group is you don't sit in silence for that long. You're absolutely right. She was telling us over and over again in the group in so many ways that she did not want to talk and she did not want people to talk at her. And again, we could misinterpret that as you're being resistant to dropping into the bottom of the U, but we knew enough of her story to be like, that's not true. You have done work, you have dropped into it. And it's incredibly lonely and isolating and alienating for you to be down there and not have anyone who can, what you're saying, bear witness and be with you in it.
Well, Jen, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. When I first heard you teach about these things, I knew that I wanted to have you on the podcast because I wanted people to hear your reflections and what you've learned through working with people of color in the healing process. It's just so essential. So thank you for your words.
Thank you for having me on the podcast. And thank you too for just being such a great ally and partner in doing this work together and kind of learning from one another. My time co leading with you was a real gift and something that I will remember and cherish. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode of The Place We Find Ourselves. I want to let you know that the Allender Center is doing a conference, a 2-day online conference, July 22nd to 23rd, called Effective Trauma Care. And this is a great 2-day training for people who are interested in understanding the impact of trauma, either on yourself or on other people. It's designed to equip mental health practitioners, ministry leaders with the tools to engage trauma and story effectively. So if that's interesting to you, please go to theallendercenter.org and click on the events tab, and you can sign up for that conference. Have a great couple of weeks.